Okay, we are going to start the Q&A.
The Cuban political system is frequently referred to as a grassroots democracy. Now, I've heard of a level playing field being established in elections so that all candidates stand on their own individual reputations and don't have, say, the Communist Party backing for a communist candidate. Now, can you tell us more about the system?
There's two things there, really. You mentioned grassroots politics. There is a participation in political decisions by groups like the organisation they've got in every block, the Committee for the Defence of the Revolution, the Women's Federation that Maria mentioned, the Workers' Parliament. So outside the National Assembly, outside the Parliament, there is also participation by those groups. When they, for example, when they changed the pension age here, actually it was quite similar to here, you know, raising the pension age. But here it goes through Parliament and the Parliament representatives decide it. There they had 6 months going to all those groups to talk about tweaking it and changing it and so on. And then it comes back to the National Assembly. So there's a grassroots politics which is outside the National Assembly, outside the parliamentary system to start with. The parliamentary system itself, you're right, is a non-party system. That is to say, there are 3 levels: municipal, provincial and national, and the participation process begins with the nomination of candidates as well as the election at a municipal level. But they're nominated as individuals, individual local representatives, and they're not paid anything. The MPs are not paid anything. If they become ministers, they are. But the MPs are not paid. They're giving leave from their work, and they go from their work to the sessions of Parliament and then return to their work. So they stand as individuals and not as party members, because, as you probably know, Bruce, the Cuban Communist Party is not an electoral party because there are no party systems there. So they stand as individuals. The outstanding candidates from the municipal level then get nominated for election to the provincial and then to the Assembly, to the National Assembly. So, you know, in the past, you know, if you were Fidel Castro or anyone else, you would stand as a member at a municipal seat. Fidel had a seat in Santiago de Cuba for many years. Basically, he was elected at a local level there and then pass on up to be a member of the National Assembly. That's briefly how it works.
When I asked that question, and to say simply, they said we don't elect people on the promise. We elect them of what they've done for us. So they say, well, if they would be working at grassroots and they've been doing a hard work, then they might get a name and they'll be elected. But if they have promise, they're not going to get any election. Unlike here, it's very different from this system.
Alice Beecham. I was a bit late, but I'm going to buy a ticket to Cuba. The system seems pretty good to me. Can you enlighten me the reason the revolution came to Cuba, of all possible countries? Is that because there was a Castro, or were there some specific conditions in the country that would have led to that?
I think it's a combination of both, Alice. Cuba had a particular history in that it was the last country to get its independence from the Spanish. It had slavery longer than any other country, and then during the Spanish-American War, the US intervened and snatched victory from their grasp, more or less, so, and imposed a constitution which had, you know, cut out parts of the island like Guantanamo Bay and so on, and humiliated them. Then they turned it into a casino economy, basically run by the mafia. So there was a huge amount of resentment. I think 80%, more than 80% of the land was owned by US companies, you know. So it was an extreme type of domination, and in face of a tradition, a militant tradition. There had been 2 major wars of independence in the 19th century and a third smaller one. And really what Martí spoke of at the end of the 19th century, he foreshadowed, even when Cuba was not independent, the need for a second independence, that is to say, independence from neo-colonial systems. So Cuba had a peculiar history, but then you can't discount the fact that extraordinary personalities like Fidel had an impact as well.
Yeah, Brian Concan. That was great, Maria, for your first public speaking engagement. Congratulations. Yeah, I'd like to direct my attention to Tim. He was stitched up for the Hilton bombing escapade. The police seem to work on a system of the better you are at stitching people up, the faster you get promoted through the ranks. Recently we've had Tony Eastman acquitted because bodgy forensics, the Mickelbergs, and I believe there's countless other poor prisoners who've been stitched up. I'd just like to know your view. Do you think things are getting any better now compared to when you were stitched up?
I couldn't really say, Brian. I haven't been near police or courts for a few decades, so I'm happy about that.
Yay!
Very good. I wanted to ask, or maybe particularly Tim, you mentioned that, you know, the Cubans say we do not present a model, we don't have a model of socialism, but the other side of it is they are intensely internationalist. The Cuban Revolution has always been internationalist, from Latin America to Africa to everywhere. It's not widely appreciated, I think, that Cuba played a critical role, absolutely crucial role, in the downfall of apartheid South Africa. The Cuban troops in Angola defeated the South African troops, and it actually played a critical role. Mandela, the first thing he did after he was released, was went to Cuba. But the critical issue today is Latin America and Cuba's role in Latin America. I think when we look at the world today, we get a pretty depressing picture. But the one place in the world where the left is winning is Latin America. The left is winning in Latin America. Left-wing governments are coming to power. Left-wing governments have established themselves, and Cuba has a critical role in that. So I wonder if you could just comment on the role of Cuba and the importance of what is happening in Latin America, in Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, El Salvador, and actually right through Latin America. It's a very, very striking alternative being presented now to neoliberalism on a world scale. And Cuba has played such a critical role. If you could just comment on that, thanks.
You're right about South African case, and if anyone wants to read on that, there's a brilliant historian called Piero Glacasis, who's written 2 books. He's a North American, one called Conflicting Missions and the other one called Visions of Freedom, about the role of Cuba in Africa. Excellent books if anyone wants to read that sort of history. On the Latin American, I agree with you. I think that the Cuban role in Latin American integration has been critical. Of course, behind all those big social missions of education, health, and the disabilities mission, which has swept across a lot of South America. It's not very well known fact, but Fidel Castro went to Venezuela in 1959, a few months after the Cuban Revolution, and said, Latin America has to unite, and Venezuela has to lead that process of unification in 1959. Now, a lot happened between 1959 and 2004 when the first ALBA agreements were signed, and then of course it was the late President Chavez that drove that with his political will and the resources of Venezuela, and also the creation of CELAC, the most complete organisation in Latin America, which has a rotating presidency, not a permanent organisation yet. But one thing to notice about that, I'll go back to the point I made before about models, is that if you looked at the core groups of ALBA, that say the left-wing Latin groups in the ALBA, which is 9 countries, CELAC has 33 countries, so they've included, and the strategy of Fidel and Chavez was to include even the right-wing Latin American governments, because they share that historical tradition. So that was a really important card they were playing. You know, Colombia, which the worst of all the governments, for example, Chavez and Fidel were always strategizing, you know, how they would include them in that process, and they succeeded. And that is the reason why they've got a very diverse group. Even, say, Bolivia and Ecuador, Venezuela, Cuba, very different systems in a way, but they share certain values. But if you looked at what's happening with their economy, you know, there's some sort of progressive social democracy going on in Ecuador and Bolivia, for example, a more radical version in Venezuela, and something entirely different in Cuba. But they don't argue about the model that they're employing. They respect that difference. So there is a union there which has to do with certain principles and not, you know, what's happening in Ecuador is entirely different to what's happening in Cuba, for example. There's election in Bolivia. It looks like Evo Morales is going to win again convincingly, but what is happening in Bolivia is a lot short of a lot of expectations there, but nevertheless it's another legitimate process there. So what they managed to achieve by including the right-wing Latin American governments is interesting, because the force of having CELAC, and everyone there agrees that Chavez was the main driver of creating CELAC back just 2 or 3 years ago, was that, for example, when there's the latest attempted coup backed by the US, be it in Bolivia or Ecuador or Paraguay or Uruguay or wherever it is, the Latin Americans get together. When there was a destabilization in Venezuela earlier this year, the foreign ministers of UNASUR, another one of the South American Union, UNASUR got together and resolved the problem without Washington mediating that issue. You see, Washington's pretending to mediate all those issues in Palestine, Israel and so on. It's doing nothing of the sort, of course. And it was destabilising in Latin America in a similar sort of way. Now the destabilisation in Latin America, whether it's in Honduras, the coup in Honduras, or the destabilisation in Venezuela, can be dealt with by the Latins themselves. And that's a very important lesson. It's probably a lesson for the Middle East too. But it does occur in the context of you having very different systems, very different, let's say, societies that have come together.
4 weeks ago there was a foreign correspondent story run on the ABC, which the correspondent went to East Timor and did a report on an American middle-class doctor who had sold up and gone to East Timor to help the poor, and an American trained East Timorese nurse who was also helping the poor, and a chap with a heart problem who was fortunate enough to get to Australia to have major surgery done on him. There was no talk at all of the contribution the Cubans had made to the East Timor Health Service in that program, and the impression it left with me and anyone who watched it was that we're doing the good work there. The backbone of the East Timorese Health Service is manned by Cuban health professionals and doctors that have been trained in Cuba. Could you perhaps elaborate on that as part of Jim's comment about the international contribution that Cuba's been made? And why are we silent here in the media about the contribution Cuba's made on our doorsteps?
Damn right.
And people can, I suppose, put together their own conclusions about why we are silent here. It's a good question, but I'll start at the beginning. It's true that the Cuban health program in Timor has been enormous. I've been fairly closely watching it and making little documentaries and so on it. Actually, it's not true that the Cubans are the major health providers there now. Cuban-trained Timorese doctors are the main health providers. Over 800 have graduated. The country 5 years ago had about 70 doctors, and now it's got about 900. And the vast majority of them are Cuban-trained Timorese. They, including young Sophie McNeil, who did that story, she should have known better really, but they've ignored this entirely. They ignored the 800 graduated doctors, the really good news story in the region there. And actually the online version of that story said worsening health crisis in Timor. I had a look at it and I thought, well, there's a lot of health problems in Timor, it's true. But how is it worsening health crisis? And if you go to UNICEF, UNICEF confirms that the infant mortality rate in Timor in a decade has come down from 120 odd to less than 50. So that's not in all respects a worsening health crisis. There are serious problems in Timor, but there's been some very shoddy reporting and a complete, really a sensorial sort of lack of interest there.
what's been on my mind, and I think on the minds of so many of us, has been the extraordinary revelations of the degree of toxic, dangerous sexism in Australia. One woman every week now in Australia gets killed by her partner, and of course the actual closure of women's refuges. So that's prompted me to be very interested, of course, in what you were saying about all the resources that have been established in Cuba for women. But I would like to know more on a personal level, given that for so long the culture between genders in, I'd say, Latin America has been a rather macho one. What difference has it made in the actual personal relationships that you've observed between men and women of all these wonderful reforms that have been brought about in Cuba? Do you understand my question? Yeah. And I'd like to hear from both of you.
They still have the cultural patriarchal, like, you know, the Latin thing, but they tried through this women's federation. They tried to have the same rights.
I don't know if I can.
Hello? Yeah? Yeah, I understand now.
It's a mic. It's okay, it's okay. That's right, speaking.
Okay. All right. They're trying to eradicate that, and they're working towards this. It's a kind of a culture of men. They have better. I understood that they have this because of the rights are so entrenched. They have the same rights, and at work they try to protect women's rights, and they have kind of better services to help them in the work because they have childcare, they have good education, so they can compete for those jobs. You know, most of the women are very good educated, and we saw in the statistics that they're higher than men in some fields. So because the system supports working women, unlike here, where to pay for an education, a single man after experiencing domestic violence, I can tell you many examples on Centrelink, and they can't pay education, they can't pay childcare. There is no family, no support, no community support. They got that. They got the community support around them, and they have services around them. So they can, if they want, they can professionally be successful. And in the kind of sexist way, well, you know, it's a lot. They're trying to eradicate that. And Latin culture is a bit different from Anglo culture, and there is a lot of more proximity. And when you arrive in Cuba, and everyone gets shocked, everyone kisses you. You know, men, women, you know, but that's the way. It doesn't mean that it's just the culture. And yeah, I think, I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
Well, that should be one good reason why to visit Cuba.
These things don't go away quickly, you know.
So what actually have you been going in any time?
I look more at the gay stuff myself, which was a little bit similar because basically the government's ahead of the culture in that respect, you know. And you may know that Raul's daughter, Mariela Castro, has been a big champion of rights of gay and transgender people and so on. But in that area, the advantage they've got something called intersectoral coordination, where they've got a health program that can go into the schools, can go into the television, the soapies. They can have that sort of stuff, so that they're talking about gay couples on their soapies, you know, and HIV prevention there, more or less, you know. So, but in that area, and I wrote a couple of articles which are also on this site here on the HIV program there, and the, you know, Cuba's one of the few governments that actually sponsors, supports Anti-Homophobia Day every year these days, you know. So, but anyway, back to your point. No, there's still a lot of machismo in Cuba. You know, you can't deny that, and homophobia and so on. But they, you know, they are addressing those things.
Do you see a change that's happened over the time you've been going?
At that level, no. Other changes at that level, no, because I think these things are much longer, you know, and so I couldn't say I'd seen change.
Thank you. Next question. Yeah, coming. Last.
Thank you. As many people here know, as many people here know in Australia in the popular press, we're always getting information, and even from the American press, about the lack of freedom of speech and lack of movement. And I suppose a lot of it comes from the Cubans in Florida, but also from the right-wing press. So I'm just wondering if you could enlighten us a bit on that in terms of people, there's always been this idea that comes out that people aren't allowed to leave the country, and also, I suppose, the whole issue of critique and criticism of the culture and political system there.
There's sort of two big areas that you raised, really. If you talk about speech, I think the thing is people have very strong opinions. Educated people with very strong values have very strong opinions. Cubans express themselves very strongly. But what you've got there is not a police state, because they're not armed in the way that US police are armed. There's nothing like that at all. But there is a lot of surveillance, and there's, there's a very strong moral pressure in the country, you know. If you haven't done your duty by, going down to, participating in this, people will know about it and talk about it. So there's a lot of moral pressure. In fact, the revolution to some extent depends on that. People know what you're doing and they know what you're not doing and so on. So there are strong moral pressures that probably make some people feel uncomfortable if they want to opt out. Although, if you noticed, there was that famous film, Strawberries and Chocolate, from the early 90s, 22 years ago, about the gay man and the young communist boy who he was seducing, and the gay man was reactionary, and his expression was, the only thing they do well in this country is the ice cream, while he's having a strawberry ice cream. So they set that whole thing up about, that, and the state funded that, with the idea to sort of generate some greater level of tolerance. But the migration thing's changed a lot over the years. There was an accord with the Clinton administration 20 years ago. There was one in the 80s too, but it sort of fell over. One under the Clinton administration 20 years ago that set a minimum number of migrants to go to the US. In other words, to make the process orderly, because there's always been migration in Cuba. Every family member, including the Castros, have got people in the US and some in Spain, Before the revolution, Cuba was #1 in emigration rates in Latin America to the US. Now it's #8, I think. But the problem is, it's a politicized system, more or less. The US, on the one hand, by an act from the 1960s, the Cuban Adjustment Act, privileged any Cubans who arrive, put a foot on dry land in Cuba, they'll get a green card. None of the other Latin Americans get that. But they won't regularize the way of people getting there. So the people with some resources go and overstay their visa. The poor people get on a raft and risk their lives going across the strait. And the US like to keep that going because they want to keep the idea of a crisis that people are fleeing a communist regime and so on. Cuban government wanted to regularise that. They got this accord 20 years ago with a supposed minimum of 20,000 a year. In practice, it hasn't got much more than that. But there is a sort of a somewhat more regularised migration there. Now, in other respects, salaries are low in terms of people travelling, so most Cubans travel as professionals in missions, and there are big benefits there. The doctors in Timor, for example, their salaries they're now being paid by the Timorese government because Timor's got oil and gas money. They get between $600 and $1,000 a month, which is very good money for Cuban doctors, so they save it, they take it home and so on. Others, it's true that they've just liberalised about a couple of years ago the exit permits. The exit permits were to try and stop a big brain drain flow, or to not to lose people in strategic positions there, but they're breaking that sort of stuff down now too. Whereas on the other side of things, the Bush administration set up a regime where they would actively recruit. It was called a parole system. They would actually recruit Cuban doctors to bring them to the US, so poach them for their side of the brain drain. So it's quite a complicated migratory sort of relationship. There's a guy called Ernesto Rodrigo Chavez in Mexico who's written a lot on this, and he makes it very clear it's been pretty much economic migration. There's been very little political refugee scenarios there, but it's a complicated system because of that relationship.
I just like to add up, because of the embargo is now stronger with the Obama administration, and no one wants to do business with the Cuban embassy in Washington, so they don't have an embassy there. So a lot of Americans, now that they freely can go to Cuba, and because of the crisis in Europe and in a lot of places, a lot of the ones that they left Cuba time ago, they're returning. I believe that they're returning. I read that a couple of planes a week to Cuba because of the system, and they stay there and people welcome them. They know what they've done, but they welcome back. But it's harder now that the embargo has has penalized some of the latest one of the French banks, Paribas, has to pay millions of dollars for doing some business with Cuba, and so no one in Washington, in America, is allowed to have money from Cuba to pay the salaries of the diplomats there. So they don't have an embassy. So a lot of the times the Cubans have to travel to visit their families without their visas and sometimes no passports. This is what I heard the latest.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then it concludes this session of Politics in the Crowd. So please join me in thanking the two speakers for their wonderful talk, as well as